The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow over the city of San Francisco. In the quiet suburb of Mill Valley, a group of friends gathered around their 2 fully packed SUVs. They were about to embark on a winter camping trip in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a journey they had planned for months. John, the group's leader, was a history teacher with a fascination for the Donner Party. He had suggested retracing the infamous pioneer's path, and his friends, all experienced hikers, had agreed. There was Sarah, a nurse with a warm smile and a knack for keeping everyone's spirits high. Mike and Lisa, a married couple, were both engineers, practical and resourceful. Then there was Tom, a freelance writer with a love for adventure. And finally, Rachel, a psychologist who was always ready to lend an ear. Their gear was meticulously packed, each item carefully selected for its utility and weight. Tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, food supplies, first aid kits, and communication devices were all packed. They had studied the weather forecasts, planned their route, and prepared for emergencies. They felt ready. As the city faded into the distance, the friends chatted excitedly, their conversation filled with laughter and anticipation. The journey to the mountains was long, but the stunning views of the snow-capped peaks in the distance made it worthwhile. They stopped occasionally to stretch their legs, take photos, and enjoy the beauty of the landscape. By late afternoon, they reached the trailhead. The air was noticeably colder here, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of snow. They donned their winter gear, checked their equipment one last time, and set off into the wilderness. The only sounds were the crunching of their boots in the snow and the occasional call of a distant bird. As the sun began to set, they set up camp for the night. The tents were pitched, a fire was started, and a simple meal was cooked. As they sat around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, the excitement was palpable. They were finally on their adventure, retracing the steps of the Donner Party, unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. The first day of their journey ended with a clear, starlit sky. One by one, they retreated into their tents, the fire slowly dying out. The silence of the wilderness enveloped them, a stark contrast to the city's hustle and bustle they had left behind. The morning sun painted the sky with hues of pink and orange as the group stirred from their tents. The air was crisp and cold, but the sight of the snow-covered mountains bathed in the morning light filled them with awe and excitement. After a quick breakfast of hot oatmeal and coffee, they packed up their camp and set off. John, with a map in hand, led the group along the trail. As they trudged through the snow, he began to recount the story of the Donner Party. He spoke of the pioneers who, in the mid-19th century, had taken the same path they were now following. His voice echoed in the stillness of the wilderness as he told of the hardships the Donner Party had faced, their struggle for survival in the harsh winter, and the grim fate that had befallen them. The group listened in silence, their laughter from the previous day replaced by a somber mood. The story was chilling, but it also made their adventure feel more real, more significant. They were not just on a camping trip. They were walking through history, retracing the steps of those who had come before them. As they hiked, they took turns breaking the trail, the physical effort keeping them warm in the freezing temperatures. They marveled at the untouched beauty of the landscape, the towering pine trees heavy with snow, the frozen streams, and the occasional animal tracks in the snow. By midday, they reached a clearing that offered a panoramic view of the mountains. They decided to stop for lunch, using the opportunity to rest and take in the breathtaking scenery. As they ate their sandwiches and sipped on hot soup, they discussed the story of the Donner Party, each expressing their thoughts and feelings about the tragic tale. The afternoon hike was more challenging, the terrain becoming steeper and the snow deeper. But they pressed on, motivated by the sense of adventure and the historical significance of their journey. As the day wore on, they found a suitable spot to set up camp for the night. As they sat around the campfire that evening, the story of the Donner Party still hung heavily in the air. The wilderness around them seemed more imposing, more mysterious, but they were together, a group of friends on an adventure, and they felt safe and secure in each other's company. They went to bed that night with the echoes of the past in their minds, the stars above them, a silent witness to their journey. They were following in the footsteps of the Donner Party, but they were confident that their story would have a different ending. After all, their modern camping equipment would keep them safe from the snow and cold. Also, they had plenty of food and supplies, and they had a satellite phone in case they had a real emergency. The morning of the third day dawned clear and bright. After a hearty breakfast, the group packed up their camp and continued their journey. The trail was becoming increasingly difficult, the snow deeper and the terrain steeper, but they pressed on, their spirits high. As the day progressed, however, the sky began to darken. Clouds rolled in, casting a gloomy shadow over the landscape. A biting wind picked up, sending shivers down their spines despite their warm clothing. John checked his weather radio, but there was no signal. They were too deep in the mountains. The first snowflakes fell gently, almost unnoticed. But soon, the snowfall grew heavier. The wind howled, whipping the snow into a blinding flurry. They were caught in a snowstorm. John, realizing the danger, made the decision to set up camp. They found a spot sheltered by a cluster of trees and quickly went to work. The snow was falling so heavily that they could barely see each other. Their fingers were numb, their bodies shivering from the cold. Despite the harsh conditions, they managed to pitch their tents and gather some firewood. They huddled around the fire, their faces pale and their bodies shivering. The laughter and excitement of the previous days were replaced by a tense silence. As night fell, the snowstorm intensified. The wind howled like a wild beast, shaking their tents and chilling them to the bone. They huddled together for warmth, their breaths visible in the freezing air. Suddenly, they heard a loud rumbling sound. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they realized what it was. An avalanche. They watched in horror as a wall of snow rushed down the mountain, heading straight for their camp. They barely had time to react. The avalanche hit their camp with a deafening roar, burying their supplies and destroying their tents. They were thrown off their feet, the world spinning around them. When the snow finally settled, they found themselves in a world of white. Their camp was gone, their supplies buried under a thick layer of snow. They were fortunate to have survived the avalanche, but without supplies, how much longer would they be able to last? As they huddled together in the freezing cold, the reality of their situation sank in. They were stranded in the Sierra Nevada mountains, caught in a snowstorm, with no way to call for help. The echoes of the Donner Party's story seemed to haunt them. The chilling tale now, a terrifying reality. The morning after the avalanche was eerily quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. The world around them was a sea of white, their campsite obliterated under a thick blanket of snow. The once familiar trail was now unrecognizable, their footprints from the previous days erased. The group had huddled together for warmth during the night, their faces pale and their bodies stiff from the cold. Their breaths hung in the freezing air as they surveyed the damage. Their supplies, food, cooking equipment, first aid kits, were all buried under the snow. Their satellite phone was damaged beyond repair, and nobody could get any reception on their cell phones. The gravity of their situation was overwhelming. They were stranded in the wilderness, with no way to call for help. The trail they had been following was now hidden, their path forward uncertain. The echoes of the Donner Party's story, once a chilling tale around the campfire, now seemed like a grim prophecy. Despite the despair threatening to engulf them, they knew they had to act. They began to dig through the snow, hoping to recover some of their supplies. It was back-breaking work, the cold seeping into their bones. But they persevered, driven by the instinct to survive. By the end of the day, they had managed to recover some of their food supplies and a few pieces of equipment. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them going for a few days. They set up a makeshift camp, using what was left of their tents and gear. As night fell, they huddled together for warmth, their bodies exhausted and their spirits low. The fire they managed to start provided some warmth, but it did little to lift their spirits. The laughter and camaraderie of the previous days seemed like a distant memory. They went to sleep that night with growling stomachs and heavy hearts, the silence of the wilderness a stark reminder of their isolation. They were stranded in the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter, their survival uncertain. The days following the avalanche were a blur of cold, hunger, and fear. They rationed their recovered food supplies carefully, knowing they had to make them last. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones and making every movement a struggle. but they persevered, their will to survive stronger than the hardships they faced. As their situation worsened, strange things began to happen. It started with whispers in the wind, soft and indistinct, like voices carried from a distance. They dismissed it as the wind howling through the trees, but the whispers persisted, growing louder with each passing day. Then came the shadowy figures. They would catch glimpses of them out of the corners of their eyes, dark shapes moving in the snow. When Thalia turned to look, there would be nothing there. They told themselves it was just their minds playing tricks on them, the result of stress and fear. The footprints were harder to dismiss. They would wake up in the morning to find footprints around their camp, too large to be any animals. They were deep and distinct, as if made by a heavy, bipedal creature. They followed no discernible path, appearing and disappearing without reason. John, the historian of the group, couldn't help but draw parallels with the story of the Donner Party. He recalled tales of strange occurrences, of pioneers reporting whispers in the wind and shadowy figures in the snow. He shared these stories with the group, his voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. The stories added to the eerie atmosphere, fueling their growing fear and paranoia. They began to suspect that they were not alone, that something was out there in the wilderness with them. The spirits of the Donner Party, perhaps, haunting the same path they had taken all those years ago. They couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The wilderness around them seemed to come alive at night, the whispers growing louder, the shadowy figures more frequent. The days turned into a week, and the strange occurrences continued. The whispers in the wind were now constant, a haunting soundtrack to their struggle for survival. The shadowy figures seemed to grow bolder, appearing more frequently and closer to their camp. The footprints in the snow multiplied, encircling their camp in a maze of mysterious tracks. One night, Tom, the writer of the group, woke up to a soft whispering sound. He unzipped his tent and peered out into the darkness. The fire had died down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the snow. As he watched, a shadow detached itself from the darkness and moved. It was a figure, tall and thin, walking slowly around their camp. Tom held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as the figure moved, its form indistinct in the darkness. It seemed to be circling their camp, its movement slow and deliberate. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, melting back into the shadows. The next morning, Tom shared his experience with the group. His story was met with a heavy silence. They had all seen the shadowy figures, had all heard the whispers in the wind, but this was different. This was closer, more real. The footprints around their camp seemed to confirm Tom's story. They were deeper, more distinct, as if the creature had come closer during the night. They followed the tracks with their eyes, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fear. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of dread. They kept a constant watch, their eyes scanning the snow for any sign of the shadowy figures. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, the words still indistinct, but the tone unmistakably ominous. As they huddled together for warmth, their food supplies dwindling and their hope fading, they couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The wilderness around them was no longer just a physical barrier. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with unseen dangers and haunting echoes of the past. 2 weeks had passed since the avalanche, and their situation was growing increasingly dire. Their food supplies were nearly depleted, their bodies growing weaker with each passing day. The cold was relentless, seeping into their bones and sapping their strength. The haunting whispers and shadowy figures continued to torment them, adding to their growing sense of despair. One morning, after a meager breakfast of the last of their dried fruit and nuts, John broached the subject they had all been avoiding. Their food was gone, and they had no way of knowing when, or if, rescue would come. They were facing the horrifying possibility of starvation. John spoke in a low, steady voice, his words cutting through the cold air. He reminded them of the Donner Party, of the desperate measures they had resorted to in order to survive. His words hung heavily in the silence, a chilling echo of their own situation. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Sarah, the nurse, recoiled in horror, her face pale. Mike and Lisa, the practical engineers, exchanged a look of disbelief. Tom, the writer, stared at John in stunned silence. Rachel, the psychologist, was the only one who didn't react, her face a mask of calm. The idea was unthinkable, a violation of the most basic human values. But they were not just humans now, they were survivors, stranded in the wilderness, facing the brutal reality of their situation. They were forced to confront the horrifying possibility of resorting to cannibalism. The day passed in a blur of fear and uncertainty. They tried to keep busy, to keep their minds off their hunger and the chilling discussion. But the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was a constant reminder of their situation, of the desperate measures they might have to take. As night fell, they crowded around the fire, their bodies shivering and their stomachs growling. The fire provided some warmth, but it did little to lift their spirits. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, the shadowy figures more frequent. The once close-knit group of friends found themselves drifting apart, each lost in their own thoughts and fears. The bonds of friendship that had once been their strength were now fraying under the strain of their situation. Sarah, the nurse, spent most of her time alone, her usually warm smile replaced by a haunted look. Mike and Lisa, the married couple, clung to each other, their shared fear creating a barrier between them and the rest of the group. Tom, the writer, had taken to scribbling in his notebook, his pen scratching against the paper, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Rachel, the psychologist, tried to maintain a sense of calm, but the strain was evident in her tight smile and distant gaze. John, the group's leader, watched his friends with a heavy heart. He had brought them on this journey, had led them into this nightmare. The weight of their situation, the fear and uncertainty, was a constant burden on his shoulders. As their hunger grew, so did their desperation. They began to look at each other differently, their gazes filled with a chilling mix of fear and desperation. The unthinkable idea that had been voiced was now a silent specter, haunting their every interaction. One night, as they huddled around the dying fire, a heated argument broke out. Accusations were hurled, blame assigned, and harsh words exchanged. The tension that had been building finally erupted. The bonds of friendship strained to their breaking point. The argument ended as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a heavy silence. They retreated to their separate corners, the fire dying out and plunging the camp into darkness. The morning after the argument was grim. The tension was palpable, the silence heavy. They went about their morning routines mechanically, their movements slow and their faces pale. The hunger was a constant gnawing in their stomachs, their bodies weak and their spirits low. As the day wore on, Sarah, the nurse, fell ill. She was weak, her face pale and her body shivering despite the layers of clothing. She tried to brush it off, to assure them that she was fine, but they could see the truth in her glassy eyes and the pallor of her skin. They watched in helpless despair as Sarah's condition worsened. She was too weak to move, her breaths shallow and her pulse weak. They had no medical supplies, no way to treat her. They could only watch as their friend suffered, her body succumbing to the cold and hunger. John was the one who voiced the unthinkable. Sarah was dying, and they were starving. They could use her body, could survive off it. His voice was low, his words cutting through the cold air like a knife. The reaction was immediate. Mike and Lisa recoiled in horror, their faces a mask of disbelief. Tom, the writer, stared at John in stunned silence, his pen frozen in his hand. The idea was horrifying, a violation of the most basic human values. But they were not just humans now. They were survivors, stranded in the wilderness, facing the brutal reality of their situation. They were forced to confront the horrifying possibility of resorting to cannibalism. The night passed in a blur of fear and uncertainty. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire died out, plunging the camp into darkness. As they went to sleep, the echoes of the past and the fear of the future weighed heavily on their minds. They were stranded in the Sierra Nevada mountains, their situation growing more dire with each passing day. The story of the Donner Party, once a chilling tale of survival, was now a terrifying reality. The morning dawned clear and cold, the sun a distant cold orb in the sky. The camp was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Sarah was unconscious now, her breath shallow and her skin cold to the touch. The decision that lay before them was a heavy weight, a horrifying choice that none of them wanted to make. As the day wore on, they sat in silence, each wrestling with their own conscience. The hunger was a constant gnawing in their stomachs, their bodies weak and their spirits low. Then, in the late afternoon, they heard a sound. It was distant at first, a faint buzzing that grew louder with each passing second. They looked at each other, hope dawning in their eyes. It was the sound of a helicopter. They rushed out of their camp, waving their arms and shouting. The helicopter circled above them, a beacon of hope in the bleak wilderness. Then, with a gust of wind and a flurry of snow, it landed. The rescue team was a sight for sore eyes. They were bundled into the helicopter, their bodies weak, but their spirits lifted. As they flew away from the mountains, they looked down at the snow-covered landscape, a beautiful but deadly trap that they had barely escaped. Back in civilization, they were treated for hypothermia and malnutrition. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, her condition critical but stable. They were interviewed by the media, their story a chilling tale of survival that gripped the nation. But they were forever changed by their experience. For the rest of their lives, no one in the group ever spoke about how close they had come to making a terrible decision that would have changed their lives forever.